Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's quick tutorial I'm going to show you my favorite method for cutting fabric on the bias. You can use this technique for any pattern you like because the process is always the same. Cutting on the bias might seem scary at first, but I promise it's super easy once you know a few simple rules. So let's get started. The first step is to always pre-wash your fabric before sewing. This helps the fibers shrink and stabilize so they won't shrink after you sew your garment. This applies to natural fabrics, synthetics, and even polyester. Pre-washing ensures that any shrinking or color bleeding happens before you spend hours sewing your garment. I personally always pre-wash all my fabrics. I also recommend using color catching wipes with new fabrics to avoid color transfer during the first wash, which usually happens. Once your fabric is washed and dry, press it with a hot steam iron to smooth out any wrinkles. This makes it much easier to cut accurately. For this method of cutting on the bias, all pieces are cut from a single layer of fabric. If your pattern requires mirrored pieces, you will need to cut the same panel twice as mirrored images. Before you start cutting, prepare the mirrored pieces by tracing the grain line on the reverse side. To do this, pin two small holes along the grain line, flip the pattern piece and connect the dots to trace the grain line on the reverse side, and draw a line indicating the direction of the grain line. This will guide you in cutting one piece on one side and then flipping it to cut the mirrored piece. Before you start cutting, it's important to identify the right and wrong sides of the fabric. The easiest way to do this is by looking at the selvage edges. On many fabrics, the selvage has small dots. The right side usually has raised dots, while the wrong side has flat dots. If you can't see this clearly, check how the fabric looks under natural light, and you can choose which side you prefer as the right side. I personally stick to the original right side, but feel free to use whichever works best for your design. Once you have identified the right side, lay your fabric flat with the right side facing up, ensuring both selvage edges are visible. Now place all the pattern pieces according to the cutting layout in the pattern and make sure they fit on the fabric before you start cutting. Position your pattern pieces at a 45-degree angle to the selvage and make sure all the pieces follow the grain line direction indicated on the pattern. This is especially important for fabrics like satin to avoid visible shifts in light reflection. To make sure you are cutting on the bias, always measure from the grain line arrow on the pattern to the selvage edge at two different points. Adjust the pattern pieces until both distances are identical. This ensures the pattern is aligned perfectly along the bias. Once the pattern is aligned, use pattern weights to hold it in place. If you are a beginner, you can use pins to secure the pattern, but insert them carefully to avoid creating wrinkles or shifting the fabric. Use scissors or a rotary cutter to carefully cut along the pattern lines, making sure to keep the fabric flat on the table or floor to avoid shifting. When cutting, make small notches at the marked points on the pattern. Once you cut each piece, make sure to clearly mark the wrong side of each piece to avoid any confusion when you start sewing. For mirrored pattern pieces, cut the first piece with the original pattern facing up, then flip the pattern to reverse the side and cut the second piece to ensure it's a mirror image. For straps and small pieces, you can fold the fabric with the right sides facing each other if they need to be cut along the straight grain. If you are cutting bias tape, follow the same method as the previous pieces cut on the bias. Place the strap pattern on the fabric, secure it with pins, and use the ruler to mark straight lines. Draw a second strap with the same measurements as the first one, secure the fabric with the pins, and cut both straps. This allows you to cut two straps at the same time, making it faster, which is especially useful if you don't have a rotary cutter. If you are cutting the lining skirt, it's best to fold the pattern along the lining hemline marked on the pattern instead of trimming it, so you can keep the main fabric skirt length for future use. Place the skirt pattern on the fabric, mark the lining hemline, then unfold the pattern and cut around the skirt. Once you have cut around the pattern, remove it and cut along the previously drawn lining hemline. Remember, the lining should be shorter than the main fabric. Even when adjusting the dress after sewing, make sure to maintain this difference between the main fabric and the lining so that the lining doesn't show on the right side of the garment. Here I have all the pattern pieces cut for the main fabric, the front skirt panel, back skirt panel, back bodice panel, two front bodice panels and straps. If you are making a dress with a lining, it should be cut similarly to the main fabric, following the instructions on the pattern. If you are cutting sleeves, they should be cut on the straight grain. In this tutorial, I'm sharing my favorite way of cutting on the bias, which is the method I always recommend for my patterns. Recently, I received a review suggesting that I could design the pattern to be cut on the fold to reduce paper printing and time spent assembling the pattern. While technically it's possible, I don't recommend this method because old thought it saves time assembling the pattern, but you will spend much more time and effort placing the pattern correctly on the fabric. It's also much harder to cut the fabric along the exact bias line, which can impact the final garment's fit. Let me show you what can happen when you use a pattern design to be cut on the fold. In the first scenario, you lay the fabric flat as a single layer, place half of the pattern on it, then flip the pattern to cut the other half. This can be tricky because it's hard to get the pattern to line up perfectly when flipping, especially with the fabrics that move around easily. As you flip the fabric, it can shift, which makes the whole process more time-consuming and stressful compared to simply cutting the full sketch from the paper pattern. In the second scenario, you fold the fabric at 45-degree angle, place the pattern and cut it on the fold. It sounds easy, however this method makes it difficult to line up the selvages correctly, which can ruin the grain line and make the bias cut uneven. Plus, this technique uses more fabric, which is another disadvantage. Of course, it's always a good idea to try different methods and find what works best for you. However, if you are a beginner, I recommend spending more time assembling the pattern carefully and cutting the pieces on a single layer of fabric for the best results. Also remember, cutting on the bias takes more time than usual, but because of the bias cut, the dress drapes beautifully with a nice flowy effect. Also, it eliminates the need for a zipper in many cases. Hopefully you enjoyed the tutorial and found it helpful in understanding how to cut on the bias. Cutting on the bias may sound scary, but it's really easy once you know these simple rules. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Happy sewing!